Synchronize them. Yeah, let's see if we can do it.
We can just talk.
So I'm going to go to the camera first to introduce the talk, and then I'll ask you to introduce yourself. Then I'll ask you about your background in what you do, what research you've done, and then we can get into the whole stuff around eating behaviour. My name is Charles Nduka, and today I'm joined by Professor Martin Yermans. We're going to discuss the science of eating and dietary behaviours. Thanks for joining us, Martin. I'd love you to just give us a quick introduction about you, your work, and your background.
Certainly, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm an experimental psychologist at the University of Sussex, where I've been since 1989. I've spent all that time studying human eating behaviour in different ways, originally thinking about what drives overconsumption and playing around with food and flavours and palatability stuff, and then more recently thinking about why do we like different things. Through all of that, I've been need to measure human eating behaviour in the lab, and I've played with various technologies and ideas to get better records of what people are consuming, how they're consuming, how fast they eat. Yeah, I still carry on today, carrying on with a whole bunch of different projects in those areas.
It's an extraordinary track record. I think you're one of the few people on the campus at Sussex University where your email address is simply martin@sussex.ac.uk, so you're probably one of the very first ones.
A good one. I don't want to lose that email. If I go emeritus, I'm insisting on keeping it.
So we met, and it's quite a funny story. I have been working on trying to develop a way of understanding facial behaviour due to my role as a plastic surgeon helping patients with facial paralysis. With that, we had this issue of not understanding whether the patients were doing their facial exercises at home between appointments. One of our engineers, Andy, he was working on the software whilst wearing the glasses to see what was going on with the facial data. He happened to have his breakfast, and while trumping away, he could see every tube he was being measured on screen. He mentioned it to me, which I thought was fascinating. I got talking to in fact, I was talking to a surgeon who initially was interested in, he's a bariatric surgeon, so he does weight loss surgery. He approached me to discuss using our technology for measuring surgeons' ability to concentrate and when they're stressed, because in surgery you cover the whole face apart from the eye area. As a surgical trainer, you can often tell when your trainee is getting stressed or confused because you're just looking at this area here. So he was interested in using glasses as a means of studying that. I mentioned to him about the eating behaviour, and he goes, "Wow, you can do that?" And I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Our dietitians have for years tried to get patients to moderate their eating rate. So chew your food at least 20 times, have a 20-second gap between bites and mouthfuls, and no bigger than a 20-piece coin, so that the food comes in slowly and you give a chance for the stomach signals to say you're full." So this is something that they told patients and haven't been able to do. He said, "You've got to talk about this." And I mentioned this to Peter Lane, who's the innovation manager here at Sussex Innovation Centre, and he said, "I've got to talk to you." So tell me a bit about the work you've been doing around eating behaviour, because particularly around measuring eating rate and eating amounts.
Yeah, so we started this back in the 1990s, soon after I arrived. I come from an animal behaviour background, analysing detailed behavioural records of food intake. I've worked with chickens and rats, and my PhD was with chickens. We were measuring in detail the microstructure of eating and drinking. And that you could do by having photo beams by the feeders, and every time that they pecked or took something we knew. When I started working with humans, I realised most people work with self-report data, not wanting to say things that you're embarrassed about. Wanting to do things which look socially acceptable means that self-report records can be terribly inaccurate. And as soon as you're asking someone to tell you what they're doing, their behaviour changes. So I wanted to be able to measure behaviour in a way that was independent of those external factors. So from the early 90s, I started hiding balances in bits of kit so that the plate was sitting on it, and when people were eating, I could record exactly when they took a bite and how much they took. It only measures that sort of inaccuracy, but we started with a very built-in-my-own sort of backyard version, and then developed it more and more. Spoke to Peter Lane here, and worked with a company, Elysium, who were based at the Innovation Centre at the time. They developed some really nice software which we could use in combination with the balance, and started commercialising it. And we sold this to about 80 research groups around the world, including some big companies. The USDA in Nebraska are using it, or were. However, it hasn't been developed since the early 2000s, so the software's out of date. And there are better ways to do things now. When Peter described what you were doing, I was extremely interested. but sceptical at the same time.
Which is entirely right. It's been quite a long journey for us developing this technology, because it started out as just an idea to do this very narrow thing, and then with more conversations recognizing that there are so many applications. I did some reading after speaking to you about this. I thought, wow, it's an opportunity to provide something that can use our existing sensors, which are relatively small but not quite small enough to get into something as small as these glasses, but which could be put into the temples, measure the dietary behaviors based on the jaw movements, and hopefully provide some value for researchers and potentially for other groups as well. Tell us a bit about the work that's been done in the past, both by yourself and by other groups, around monitoring behaviors. Maybe just give us a quick history around that, because that's fascinating.
So one of the things we were interested in was linking the eating rate to how much people consume, and testing out whether someone with habitually faster eating rates do on average when they don't get to clear their plate. I operated an impossible to finish bowl of pasta policy in my lab. Essentially, you gave people a 400 gram portion of pasta. Once they'd eaten 300 grams, the experiment was called to give them a new portion. This really fooled some people. I had one guy eat 2 kilograms. He just didn't know when to stop. We had to start cooking while he was eating, which was quite amusing. From that, we could show that eating rate was a predictor of how much they were going to consume in this voluntary, uncontrolled system. In the real world, we serve ourselves a portion. But even then, people who eat faster are more likely to get something else. We know that eating rate is really important. We could also see how food changes this, and I've been fascinated for years by palatability effects. And if I want you to eat more, I just make the food taste nicer. In the short term, it will accelerate your rate of eating. Whereas if food's bland, your rate of eating slows down more rapidly across the meal. We did lots of studies looking at the biological underpinnings of that. And we know that in the brain, the opioid system is very much involved in pleasure. Uh-huh. If you use opiate blockers like naltrexone and give people something to eat, it tastes just the same, it just doesn't taste as nice. Part of that pleasure during eating is through opioid-mediated mechanisms in the brain. If you block the opioid system and get people eating a palatable food, they don't speed up when they encounter that food.
Interesting.
So you've got a biological driver of that increased eating rate within a meal ability.
That's fascinating, because of the connection with, we have this idea of comfort eating, and in many cases, I had a patient this week, she describes herself as having an addictive personality. She's actually a nurse. She's currently on GLP-1 medications and has lost a lot of weight and wants surgery to address some of the aesthetic complications of that. She's interesting because she self-admits her drug is very stressful. She uses food to manage her stress. It's a form of self-medication, much the same way some people self-medicate with alcohol, tobacco, or other drugs.
There's a lot of theories around that individual difference. Some of it may come down to genetics, that there are different genetic makeups which make people more or less sensitive to the rewarding effects of foods. The old reward deficiency model was that if you had a reward system which was not operating perfectly, you had to do more to get your reward. People with that deficiency tended to be more prone to problem gambling, overeating. If you're a middle-class woman, you might have a larger collection of shoes than average. So all sorts of short-term sources of pleasure can then counteract that reward deficit. Interesting.
That's funny, because you mentioned shoes and shopping, and I guess it applies to men as well with things like cars. This idea of resale therapy. It's almost as if we understand within the culture, and it's embedded within the language, this idea that certain acts of consuming food, products, or content now with the current addiction to social media, it's the same underpinning that guides that.
I think you're right. The reward system in the brain didn't evolve to allow us to take cocaine. It evolved to allow us to do things important for survival: eat, drink, have sex. All of those, if you've got a deficient system, you have to do more to get the same reward. That's been the hypothesis for many years. We still don't know how much that contributes to obesity. We know there are lots of genetic factors in obesity. One of the things my students always find most confusing is when I point out the best predictor of your body size is still your genetic makeup. If you had the genetic makeup which was potentially obese 30 years ago, you didn't become obese because the environment wasn't there to allow that. But now in a modern environment, with low energy expenditure and ample high energy dense foods, it's very easy to overconsume.
That's interesting. I had a conversation with a surgical colleague of mine at Guy's. She works at King's. Now, King's have the internationally recognised twin centre, which is quite interesting. Yeah. She's a mother of twin boys, Tim Spector has done work around genetics around COVID and around, obviously he's co-founder of Zoe, and has looked at twins in terms of various things, in terms of responses to food, for example, and finds that there is a lot of differentiation, essentially things to do with exposure to antibiotics, diet, etc., and how people respond differently. One thing that was interesting with this conversation with this surgical colleague is that she has twin sons, identical twins, and they have very different eating habits, and that one of them eats, she says, painfully slowly, whilst the other one inhales his food, eats very rapidly, which I thought was interesting. I did look into it a little bit. Facial expressions and expressivity are often not genetic. It's almost like a language in that you acquire it from those around you. And you can't see your own face, but you can see the face of others, and because there are systems within the brain that mimic what you can take on others' behaviours. And so there is possibly some degree of behavioural aspects that you're acquiring from outside.
Oh, absolutely. People are always surprised to learn. We have very little in the way of genetic preference for food. We have to learn what's safe. And we're learning it even before we're born. Exposure to flavours in the womb has been shown to influence children's preferences throughout their infancy. With the genetic stuff, it's interesting. We've been working with that twins set a little bit recently about to publish stuff to do with sweet liking. And it turns out there are big individual differences in the extent to which people like sweet taste. And that is partially genetic. It's not whether you can taste it, it's how your brain reacts to it, which is quite interesting. That's fascinating for me because there's this big view in the general press that sweet liking drives sugar consumption, causes obesity. And in our data, sweet dislikers are the one who have the unhealthy body profile. Possibly because they can't get the nice sweet reward, and so overconsume all the savoury stuff, which makes up most of our energy intake.
Interesting. I'm sure we can clear it up in post-production.
We're just going to genetics and stuff, so let's go towards behaviour.
Yes. In terms of the past work around dietary behaviours and eating, you mentioned before about some work that's been done around understanding behaviours in those who are eating perhaps less than is healthy. Particularly the work that's been done in Sweden.
The Swedish group, based at the Karolinska, have known for a long time about eating rate. The way in which you interpret internal cues is a learned response. They've argued that patients with anorexia, although they manifest with all sorts of external concerns about food, most of that is secondary to the starvation they've induced by refusing to eat. And they wanted to use technology, to use a gentle way to re-expose people to food. They had a system which is a bit like our balance system. They called theirs the mandometer. It was much more overt, that you had to put everything you ate on this balance. And they used it to give feedback to their patients. So a patient would eat as they would normally from a food off this balance, and that was used as a standard. And then each week they were tasked with trying to eat just 10% faster. So they got feedback if they were going slower than that to just speed up a little. And to imagine feeling just 10% less full, because what they found to start with, a patient might eat 40 grams of food in 40 minutes and feel full within the first minute. By the end of that trial period, which could take months, the same patient might now be eating 300 grams in 15 minutes, but not really feeling full at the end of it. So it's retraining those internal signals. I think they, like many clinicians, are coming to recognise that the primary driver of anorexia is anxiety about what's going to happen if they eat food. And the fear about what will happen outweighs their desire for food. Interestingly, some anorexics become chefs because they love the taste, they love the thought, but they're scared of the consequences of eating it. Overcoming those consequences requires slow exposure, and the mandometer system seemed to achieve that.
Interesting. I think that institution is an inpatient facility where you have to have all your meals.
It was hugely expensive. They opened another 3 clinics around the world, one in Melbourne, one in Malaysia, one in America. However, the Swedish government has decided that's too expensive an approach. They're taking a slightly more hands-off approach now. So, and I think Pear's retired anyway.
What underpins that idea, there are 2 things. One is around how do you measure, i.e. both what a person's eating and how they're eating, and then the other aspect which is around the feedback. And the measurement aspect is what, as a clinician, I find really challenging. The decisions I make about medication, but particularly around things consequential to surgery, are predicated on self-report and with the dietary aspect where for social reasons, for embarrassment, or just memory, people do not necessarily say what reflects their actual behaviors. You're making decisions that are suboptimal because it's relying on what people say rather than what they've actually done. And that cuts across everything from diabetes management to infectious diseases. We have accepted it in many areas of medicine. In other areas, say cardiology, we don't prescribe medications because patients said they felt a bit dizzy. It will now measure blood pressure, which previously again was in the clinic and now can be done at home, on a continuous basis. You don't just take a one-shot measure, you want to measure over time. And that seems a much more logical way to approach things, which has driven the approach I had around facial expressions. When I'd ask patients, have you been doing exercise? And they say, doctor. And of course they feel disappointed. They don't want to disappoint me because they know I've spent 6 hours of surgery trying to fix their smile. It has consequences because the time to get the improvements is early on, and that's when they really don't want to look in the mirror. They don't really want to engage with their face that they don't like looking at. We selected our collaboration based on an initial pilot study to see whether the technology can measure. Maybe just talk a bit about that and how you designed that study.
Yeah, sure. We knew we needed to do what I call a quick and dirty experiment just to test out whether in principle the glasses could detect this. Many people have tried coming up with technologies to measure eating behaviour. Some of them are spectacularly stupid, like the fork, which had a built-in sensor and batteries. You could tell where the fork was and when it was in someone's mouth, but it was totally impractical and not accurate. We know that the gold standard for measuring eating behaviour is to video someone and then analyse the video. It takes roughly 10 hours to code a 5-minute meal properly. Because of the level of coding ambiguous facial movements, then it gets quite complicated to train up people to do this. It's very hard work doing detailed behavioural analysis at the moment. But if we combined that video technique with using the glasses, we had a way of validating what the glasses were picking up. What I'm talking about were the standard components of a normal eating event, which can be coded from a video by looking at the sensor movements from the glasses to see whether that worked. The first study, we added lots of different components. The main one was a simple breakfast with 3 items. We've analysed the bagel and the apple, getting very good correspondence between the behavioural data and the glasses data. As a scientist, I don't believe correlations of 0.9, but I have to in this case. It just measured it. That doesn't mean it's perfect. That was the first look, and there's lots of things we need to do to refine this approach. But I'm confident that given the power of modern computing to discriminate small differences in signal, we should be able to pick out a much wider range of eating behaviours from this.
Yeah, it's been fascinating for me because we've always had the approach of approaching experts like yourself and really stress testing ideas. These will be products that are going to help researchers, clinicians, people making therapies, but also end users as a self-management tool. It's super important that things are properly validated. We applied for funding and were very lucky to get funding from the Consumer Lab, which is an amazing initiative. Remind me again, how's that funded?
The Consumer Lab is a UK Research Institute, UKRI spin-out. So they've set up these 6 consumer research hubs designed to attract money where we spin out ideas into industry or collaborate directly with industry. So there's one on fortification, there's one on vitamins and stuff. There's 5 of these nutrition-related ones. The Bristol one is consumer behaviour. And they've got a pot of money they've got to spend over 5 years. And the university themselves then give out money to people who compete for that pot. It is easier to get than a lot of other UKRI money, but you've got to be in that sweet spot of studying the right sorts of behaviours that match onto that and have impact potential. This has huge impact potential.
And so we did that study with the first study beyond the initial internal proof of principle. Perhaps we can talk a bit about that.
The initial research all showed that we could measure this within a lab situation, but in a very constrained way. People sitting in a small cubicle, eating, being filmed by an iPad with glasses on and answering lots of questions on the computer screen, and then we try to infer whether this means real behaviour or not. The big question is, does this capture eating in everyday life? And that's a really big jump from being able to show you can pick up chewing in a confined space with defined foods to what happens every day. So we got people to do 3 weeks wearing the glasses, a week wearing them but doing little else, so we could just monitor behaviour. A week where they annotated everything they ate themselves alongside of wearing the glasses. What was interesting there was at the end of the day, they did a recall of the day and they were forgetting some eating events that the glasses had picked up, which was a good sign because we know that nutritional surveys always underestimate intake and we might be starting to pick up things that are... In the third week, using some simple feedback ideas to see if we can get you to moderate your eating a bit. Choose one of these different approaches. Try to eat slower, put a bigger gap between bites, take more chews. And again, we got some evidence of changes in behaviour. Very modest at this stage, but this wasn't a therapeutic trial. We weren't trying to force the behaviour change. We're getting people voluntarily to do it. I am still surprised how well we were picking up eating behaviour in the real world. I know there are other people who've been working on alternative approaches to measuring eating behaviour in the laboratory situation, but they're all so cumbersome and detailed that they couldn't be used outside the lab. Huge win.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm talking in a few weeks to Albert Kuhlman, who's at Cambridge, he does a lot of work around understanding what people are eating as part of this national initiative. I think they surveyed 5,000 people or something to get an idea of the nation's diet, which again is done by a self-report. People have to recall what they ate, and from this people are deriving dietary recommendations, which seems problematic if you really don't know what people are eating and using that information to make recommendations.
It's interesting, that National Dietary Survey has been running since 2008, I think. It's always been outsourced from government, and the unit at Cambridge have had that contract all these years. But they reliably know they are only picking up 80% of behaviour, and it frustrates them. But maybe they're not. They may be picking up all the behaviour, but the people are deliberately eating 20% less than they should do on the days when they're having to do the survey. And the survey now is you eat as you like one day, and the next day you have an interview-guided recall on 3 days a week. It's one of the gold standards for measuring someone's nutritional profile. But it's far from accurate. And that inaccuracy is not new. Back in the 1980s, 1990s, people were assuming these sorts of recall data were true, and they also were mismeasuring people's energy requirements. So the famous story is that people thought that obesity was due to a hugely underactive metabolism because people only needed 80% the calories that a normal person ate and were still putting on weight. And if you put them in a bomb calorimeter and measure their energy expenditure sitting in a chair, it's very low if you're overweight or obese because you're insulated. However, if you work out how many calories you need to support that body, it's obvious it's wrong. When people made that realisation, the whole area had to change.
Yes.
But it hasn't moved much in 30 years. We still are using dietary recall.
Yeah. But it feels that we're at a tipping point around this in the same way that no longer would the doctor just put their hands on the patient's pulse and that subjective assessment of their pulse rate would determine whether they're going to put them on some medication or other. We need to move to a more objective measure.
There is a long way to go. If someone normally wears glasses, switching their glasses for smart glasses, you'd think within a day or two they would have become acclimatised to that, and then we should get a proper record of everyday behaviour. While they're conscious that people might be monitoring them in the first bit, that might change their behaviour.
Yes. The estimates are about 64% of people have corrected vision according to the Vision Council. So even if you study people who already have people who have a very low barrier. Yeah, I haven't shown you actually. Hot off the press is, where are they now? New glasses. Oh, here they are. I'll do that again. This is our new glasses, the S1 version. The previous ones that you've seen were like this, where the sensors are in the temple, but quite thick. Fairly lightweight still, but the hinge obviously is to close them. By going to a more refined form factor, this is the new version. So the camera module is still on this side, but a much more refined version, which hopefully will mean that patients will be even less aware that they're wearing them. Yep. Also feel less self-conscious in a way because the difference in form factor means that they'll essentially look normal. Do you want to try one? Like normal.
Gosh, they fit me rather well.
Yeah. Great.
Don't correct my vision yet, though.
No, it's got the lenses in. Yeah,
That
that's
would
one
help.
thing people often ask about.
Well-
Obviously, the lenses are easy to pop in and out.
What's interesting is you mentioned the camera. I think the glasses have the biggest advantage in being able to capture an image of what people are eating in the moment. The image recognition data from food image studies is getting better. As that AI database improves, people will be able to discriminate even sandwiches apart. If you could, in the moment, say, oh, that's chewing behaviour, people are eating, capture an image, know what they're eating, that's already going a long way to getting good behavioural data patterns. What we then need to know is how much they've consumed. Today, the self-report measure is always what size portion did you have, and you choose from a number of pictures online, which portion it was. It's terribly inaccurate. Whether we can estimate intake from the chewing behaviour, that's going to be a challenge, but it shouldn't be insurmountable. If we know how much people are eating and what they're eating, we have a perfect record of their intake.
We have a few ideas around that, one of which is each person has different face structure, jaw structure, and eating dynamics, and the kind of food they're eating will influence their eating metrics. By capturing not only at the start of the meal, but sequentially over time, one can work out whether people are leaving food behind and make a more accurate estimation of not only what they ate, but also how much they ate, and importantly, in what sequence. Because I was fascinated to learn, I've gone on a steep learning curve this last year and a half since we've been working together, or 2 years, I guess, around how food order has an impact on both metabolism and what happens subsequently.
Yeah.
That eating fibre-rich foods at the beginning or protein-rich foods at the beginning will influence on blood metabolites, for example, glucose spikes.
That short-term impact of nutrients being released is very interesting and something we still don't fully understand. Some of the work we've done, which I still find quite mind-boggling, is that what you believe the food's going to do to you alters the way your gut behaves. So you've got top-down control of gastric emptying. There's some wonderful studies showing that if you think something's going to be more filling in your stomach, it alters the way the stomach behaves, what hormones are released, etc.
Fascinating. Tell me a bit more about that.
The study I liked best wasn't one of ours, but this is a group from Purdue University led by a friend of mine, Professor Rick Mattitz, and they got people to consume the same amount of energy, either as a liquid or as a jelly. But half the people who ate the jelly were convinced that it stayed jelly in their stomach, and half believed it went to liquid. Half of those who consumed the liquid were given strong evidence that it turned to jelly in their stomach. They literally had a big glass mock-up of a stomach, showed it pouring in, and it went like jelly into the stomach. How full those people felt for the 2 hours after they'd consumed this varied depending on whether it was solid or liquid in their mouth, so gastric emptying was slower.
Fascinating.
The top-down control elements are really important in the fine adjustment of our appetite control. It's not just nutrients, it's what we do with those nutrients, and that's partly driven by what our brain thinks is happening and getting our body ready for it.
That's extraordinary. It reminds me of the work that Lisa Feldman Barrett, one of our advisors, talks about around how the brain constructs. The gut-brain axis is something that we're talking about increasing now, people recognizing the relationship between the two, to be able to change how you digest based on your expectations.
I think this is something that has been missed a lot. People talk hugely about gut-to-brain signalling, and particularly in the advent of the new GLP-1 agonist-type medications. And a lot of that is to do with gut-to-brain signalling, but it's being fine-tuned. For example, the amount of cholecystokinin you get released in response to food turns out to be mainly down to the nutritional context, but it's also partly primed by what you're expecting that food to be like. So if a thick, creamy drink has energy, particularly carbohydrates, then you get CCK release. But if it's a thin water drink with the same level of carbohydrate, you don't get that same CCK release. It's the combination of the textural cue sending the signal to the brain, this is going to be filling, that sends a signal to the gut, which prepares the system to work. I didn't believe the CCK data, although it came out of my lab to start with, but I was talking to some neurobiologists last autumn, and they gave me a plausible explanation. They were very excited because that's something they can't measure in their rat models. You can't do expectation stuff in rats.
Fascinating. This area of dietary behavior is especially interesting just because of the connection of mood and diet. We spoke at the beginning around comfort eating. I guess some of it is also potentially boredom eating. So people self-medicating against their social interactions.
The interesting thing is a different subset of the population are prone to those two different effects. Work we've done and others have done has shown that people who are worried about their body size, particularly women, are much more prone to comfort eating. So they will respond to unpleasant threat by eating more. You can imagine them in a horror movie with popcorn. When they're getting scared, they're eating more. The other unrestrained people who aren't worried about their body shape or aren't trying to diet tend to be inhibited from eating when they get scared.
Interesting.
When you make people bored, the opposite happens. Those who are not worried about body size but are prone to overeat a little bit will definitely overeat when bored.
Yeah, the boredom thing is fascinating. There was a study about when people put experimentally in a situation where there was no stimulus, but then the only stimulus given to them was the opportunity to give themselves a horrible sensation. I think an electric zap. People were choosing to stimulate themselves, unpleasant, to
avoid. I know it's one of the Royal Marine tests, isn't it? You get shut into a padded cell for 24 hours and see if you can survive it. Most people, after 6 hours, are just tearing what little hair they've got out and trying to escape. So we know that our brain doesn't like a void.
I think one of the problems that have always been the case with dietary, I encountered dietary issues in terms of my surgical practice a lot because of the growing prevalence of obesity and the need to optimize patients' weight for surgery just for their better recovery. But this historical one-size-fits-all approach to dietary monitoring, what you said today, you told us now you have different responses or behaviors around boredom versus comfort. I'm sure there are lots of others. So I guess there's boredom eating, there's comfort eating, distracted eating, I guess.
Distracted eating, not just distracted eating, but being distracted from listening to the effects of food in your body. A couple of years ago, one of my favourite studies we published had people infused into their mouth with a drink, either 70 calories or 270 calories. They were doing either a simple or a complex perceptual load task on the computer screen during the infusion and for 20 minutes afterwards, and then were given snack foods. If you had perceptual capacity left to listen to your body, so you were doing a simpler task, then you ate less when you'd had the 270 calories than the 70. But if you weren't able to listen to the rest of the body, then the 200 calories didn't exist as far as you were concerned. I think a lot of mindfulness behaviour around eating over-focuses on the external and forgets to get people to focus on the internal.
Yes.
There's a strong argument that part of the driver of obesity is people being taught not to listen to their internal regulatory signals.
Yes.
Don't stop there, finish your plate full, that sort of behaviour. Understanding that you've got economically better value if you keep eating means that you're training yourself not to listen to the internal cues.
Totally. Most people are told to finish what's on your plate. There are hungry, starving children in Africa. Something that so many of us have been told. For those who have the ability to expend that energy that they're consuming, fine. But for those who aren't, for whatever reason, or have other comorbidities, then the consequences are severe.
If you do overeat at a meal, that's not problematic at all if after that you eat less for the next several meals or day or two. I always tell the story of a colleague who will remain nameless, but who's a great friend of mine, who I took to the pub and he decided to eat a pudding, this enormous Sussex pond pudding. He said he didn't eat anything for 36 hours afterwards. He felt so full, he just didn't need to eat. And we see this in the animal kingdom. It would have been a stupid system to evolve to only eat what you need in the moment if food is transitory in the environment. The crocodiles waiting for the wildebeest to migrate, eating a whole wildebeest and then go to sleep for 2 months.
Yes.
And ultimately, over the year, their body size goes up and down, but it doesn't increase beyond a certain level. Once it's got big, it goes down again. And we've lost that ability because we've not listened to those internal cues.
The abundance. Yeah. I think there's also a mechanistic aspect to this now with my very simple surgical brain. One of the treatments up until GLP-1s became introduced was bariatric, where you were physically reducing the capacity of the stomach to take on food. Initially with gastric balloons, which had issues and therefore have been used much less, and then gastric bypass and gastric sleeves. But I was surprised in looking at some of the literature and seeing how, when you look at long-term data, a significant proportion of patients will regain weight, even though their stomach was made tiny. If their behaviours didn't change, perhaps their eating rate, not giving their brains a chance to recognise when they were full, they were able to stretch their stomachs again. That's extraordinary. 'Cause you told me about, I think there's a study done with popcorn in theatre where people, when they are distracted, they just keep eating.
There's even been studies where you give people stale popcorn and they don't notice if they're enthralled in something and they'll overconsume. If you're not able to pay attention to the food cues while eating and listening to the body afterwards, it's very hard to regulate. And of course, there is this genetic element. When we're talking about people who've had bariatric surgery, almost certainly they've got multiple genetic risk factors for obesity. It may be that no manner of behavioural training is ever going to set them perfectly right again. Although there have been incidents of obesity throughout history, through most of our modern history, obesity rates were 5% of the population. And it's only since the mid-70s that it's increased so dramatically. So the modern food environment is clearly interacting with genotype driver overconsumption.
One of my patients about a month ago described she herself had lost weight with the help of GLP-1s, and I waited until she'd stabilised her weight off them before operating. So the last thing I wanted to do is operate when she'd lost the weight and then have her put it all back on again. She described her mother, who had had 2 bouts of bariatric surgery and managed to regain weight beyond that, and how her mother used to, in her words, inhale food that she would eat so quickly. And by turn, this patient of mine had also become a very rapid eater. And that's something that was really interesting to me. I think it's estimated that between 50 and 60% of people are fast eaters. Now, not all of them become overweight because it's multifactorial, but even that one thing has a role for certain people because of the evidence around increased calorie consumption and the metabolic effects.
The research, particularly coming out of London, has shown there is a heritability factor to eating rate. It's to some extent inherited, it's not entirely though. I think society also trains people to eat too fast. I remember reviewing a PhD program that actually came out of the Karolinska Institute, and one of the studies they did was looking at the eating rate of children in primary school in Sweden. As in the UK, the rule at primary school is you can't go out to play until you've finished your lunch, which puts an enormous pressure on children to eat fast. In this study, they got these children to eat the same food in 2 conditions. One, in a test situation where there was no time pressure, just eat it as you would like to, measured how much they ate and how fast they ate, and then they had the same foods presented as their lunch at primary school. The boys were eating on average 1.5 times faster. In the primary school situation, they ate more and they took less time. It teaches you not to listen to internal cues. It's uncoupling your appetite from your intake and leading to a behavioural habit which is going to put you prone to weight gain and obesity ultimately.
Yeah. It's really hard to change behaviour. That's one of the things that's very clear from the work we've been doing with my amazing team of therapists. It's really hard. And anyone who wants to try and learn, just walk more slowly. Just try to slow your walking rate. It's something so automatic and hardwired that it's actually really hard to change unless there's something that's going to give you feedback on it.
Habitual fast walker, I know exactly, because the amount of times I get grumpy because there's lots of people dawdling.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. But how much of that again is learned is interesting, and how you unlearn it. And the learning-unlearning thing I think is illustrated quite nicely, not so much by how much you eat, but what you eat.
Yes.
And the evidence is that to come to something new as a child, you have to be exposed to it at least 8 times, preferably 10 or 12. Most parents will try vegetables 2 or 3 times and then give up because they don't want the food waste. The truth is, if you keep going, then ultimately kids will come to anything. And that same perseverance in changing behaviour is essential. We talked earlier about the mandometer, the Swedish system. The NHS sponsored a trial at Bristol where they looked at overweight and obese young boys who either received just standard NHS nutritional therapy counselling or that plus a small number of sessions where their eating was monitored in the hospital sitting using a mandometer system which taught them to eat slower. And at 6 months follow-up, those boys who'd had that mandometer training were still lighter than those who'd had standard NHS therapy. So perhaps intervening early in eating rate is a really big potential.
I saw that paper too. I think it was published in the BMJ. I think they did a 1-year follow-up and did find that it was difficult to maintain. Just the fact of having to have a physical device made it difficult. The biggest companies in the world are now betting on the future where glasses replace the smartphone as a primary way to interact with technology. It may well be that when that happens, there will be a tool that essentially becomes a coach, a guidance, a dashboard to help you.
I think that's right. The portable balance system was never going to be useful outside of laboratories. Imagine your embarrassment going into your annual super meal with your wife, and you get your balance out and start weighing everything as the 7-course meal arrives. That would ruin everything, wouldn't it? But noticing with your glasses and getting subtle cues to slow down, to be mindful of what you're eating.
Yeah.
It's interesting that if you think about food, some of the most expensive meals you'll eat are not very finished. There's a way of developing satisfaction which doesn't involve consuming vast volumes, which was entirely entertaining to me, having spent a few days in an American situation where all the portions were just outrageously big. And yet they're trying to blame the nutritional balance of the food and makeup of the food as the driver of obesity. No, you're just eating too much.
Yes, the quantities. They talk about this sort of almost like a cognitive surface area where you are applying more attention to the food, so you're getting more value, you're actually consuming more of it because your attention is now on the flavour, on the textures and the colours, on the smell. Yeah. And so you're actually consuming more of it, even if it's a small quantity.
Yeah, you're becoming cognitively satisfied rather than physically full. Yeah. Very few of us eat till we're physically full anyway. Our stomach capacity is way beyond what most meals can manage.
Yes. There's one element, so one of our advisors, Hugo Critchley's done a lot of work around interoception, the ability to sense your own sensations, and his work is a lot around autism and about also blood pressure measurements, but I do wonder how much within the dietary sphere, people's ability to actually sense their fullness differs, but also can be modulated by different strategies.
Haven't looked at modulation, but in terms of individual differences, there is evidence that the methods Hugo uses can discriminate different groups. The paper we published a few years ago compared sweet likers and sweet dislikers using these various interoceptive cues. The extreme sweet likers, the ones you'd think would be most prone to obesity but turn out not to be, are very highly tuned to their body. They score significantly better even in a small sample size than the sweet dislikers on being able to count their heart rate, knowing how much when they feel full when they're drinking a glass of water. Multiple measures of interoception differ between individuals based on their phenotype, whether you like sweetness or not. Yes. Although the literature is still muddy, if we start looking at some of those groups most prone to obesity, they will be very poor interoception. But there's surprisingly not been enough done on that.
No. Fascinating. It's been really interesting talking to you about this, your work, our collaboration. Obviously, our next phase of work is to hopefully do a longer term study with the glasses, people wearing them in the real world, and looking at other parameters, including weight loss in the future. But for now, thanks so much for your time, Martin.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye.
How long was that actually? I wasn't aware of the time.
Oh,
yeah, that's good. I enjoyed that.
I can